September 1944, south of Aachen. American reconnaissance patrols approached the quiet rolling hills of the German border. Scattered across the pastures were weathered concrete bumps, dragon's teeth. Allied intelligence insisted these were harmless relics. The 1939 defensive network had supposedly been stripped of its weapons years ago, left as a hollow shell. Expecting a quiet hike into Germany, the lead scouts stepped confidently past the concrete barriers. Suddenly, the seemingly empty hillside erupted. A deadly grid of interlocking machine gun fire swept the pasture. The unstoppable American advance had just walked into a trap, slamming into a wall that was supposed to be a ghost. The sudden slaughter in those German pastures shattered a dangerous Allied illusion. After the breakout from Normandy, the American army had raced across France, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. They relied on sheer mobility, synchronized armor, and overwhelming air support. But the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, instantly stripped away those modern advantages. On paper, Allied intelligence was technically correct. The fortifications were objectively obsolete. Built in the late 1930s, the bunkers were too cramped to house modern anti-tank guns. The ventilation systems were decaying, and the original armament had long been cannibalized to supply the Eastern Front. It was a neglected, stripped-down relic, manned by a patchwork of reserve troops recovering wounded and hastily drafted civilians. Yet these damp, outdated concrete pillboxes brought the most mechanized military force on the planet to a grinding, bloody halt. The lightning war was abruptly over, replaced by a claustrophobic, static meat grinder. How exactly did a forgotten defensive network, armed with scavenged weapons, completely neutralize American mobility? How did an obsolete string of concrete traps force a modern army into a primitive, grueling siege, exacting a massive toll in blood for every single yard of German soil? To understand how a mechanized giant was brought to its knees by an abandoned fortification, you have to look at a map that had simply grown too large. By the first week of September 1944, the Allied advance was dying, not from enemy resistance, but from its own staggering success. The breakout from Normandy had triggered a frantic race across France and Belgium. Divisions had moved hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, but modern warfare is bound by a merciless mathematical tether. Every Sherman tank, every half-track, and every artillery piece required a constant, massive river of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. That river was drying up. The deep-water port of Antwerp had been captured intact, but its seaward approaches were still heavily mined and controlled by German coastal batteries, rendering the docks completely useless. This meant nearly all Allied supplies still had to be trucked in from the Normandy invasion beaches, over 300 miles behind the advancing front lines. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system running 24 hours a day, was burning enormous quantities of gasoline just to deliver gasoline. The logistical tether was stretched to its absolute breaking point. For the men of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army, approaching the German borders south of Aachen, the reality of this supply crisis was setting in. Divisions were rationing food. Tank engines were shut down to conserve the last precious drops of fuel. Crucially, the heavy 155mm artillery batteries, the primary tool for breaking fortified positions, were severely restricted, handed strict quotas on how many shells they could fire per day. To compensate for these starving supply lines, Allied High Command relied on a deeply ingrained, highly optimistic assumption. The German military apparatus was permanently broken. Intelligence reports from Supreme Headquarters painted a picture of total collapse. The Wehrmacht had lost roughly 500,000 men in the West over the summer. Surviving units were fleeing back toward the fatherland in chaotic, disorganized columns. American commanders believed that if they maintained aggressive pressure, even with rationing and exhausted infantry, they could crack the border defenses and drive straight into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. Momentum would substitute for logistics. The enemy supposedly lacked the morale, the heavy equipment, and the sheer will to organize a coherent defense. But on the other side of the border, the reality was shifting. In early September, Field Marshal Walter Model, a ruthless defensive specialist, took command of the crumbling German Army Group B. He inherited a catastrophe. Most of his divisions existed only on paper. The men crossing the border were disorganized stragglers, missing their heavy weapons and command structures. Model immediately began scraping the absolute bottom of the demographic barrel. Military police set up aggressive checkpoints behind the retreating columns, forcing anyone carrying a rifle back toward the front. To fill the gaping holes in the line, the German command threw together ad hoc formations known as Kampfgruppen. This was a desperate, brittle patchwork army. It included recovering wounded, elderly reservists, naval personnel whose ships had been sunk, Luftwaffe ground mechanics without planes, and teenagers pulled directly from the Hitler Youth. In a fluid, mobile battle across open country, these scraped-together units would have been outflanked, outgunned, and massacred by experienced American armor within hours. Model knew this. He knew these makeshift units could not survive a war of movement. But to stop the Americans, he didn't need them to maneuver. He just needed them to stand still. The German troops were shoved into the West Wall. Built in the late 1930s as a massive propaganda showpiece, the defensive belt had been effectively abandoned since the fall of France in 1940. For 4 years, it had been left to rot. Local farmers had used the bunkers to store potatoes and farm equipment. Tree roots had cracked the concrete foundations, and groundwater pooled ankle-deep in the subterranean corridors. Tactically, the pillboxes were severely degraded. Their original machine guns and specialized anti-tank cannons had long been stripped to fortify the Atlantic Wall or shipped eastward to the Russian front. Furthermore, the bunkers had been designed for older, slower-firing weapons. They lacked the mechanical ventilation systems required to clear the toxic cordite fumes generated by the rapid-firing MG-42 machine guns the defenders now carried. Firing continuously meant risking suffocation. Yet, despite the flooding, the lack of modern weapons, and the suffocating air, the raw, brutal geometry of the defense remained perfectly intact. The pillboxes were forged from heavily reinforced concrete, in some places up to 7 feet thick, impervious to standard infantry weapons and light mortars. The dragon's teeth, thousands of staggered concrete pyramids designed to trap vehicle treads and expose their unarmored bellies, were permanently anchored into the bedrock. Decades of neglect had actually improved the line in one critical way. Natural overgrowth, thick brush, and creeping vines provided flawless, organic camouflage that aerial reconnaissance completely failed to penetrate. The defensive network was designed so that every bunker covered the blind spots of its neighbors. A poorly trained Luftwaffe mechanic or a frightened 50-year-old conscript didn't need to know how to execute complex tactical maneuvers. He only needed to look through a narrow, reinforced steel slit, wait for a silhouette to enter a pre-surveyed kill zone, and pull the trigger. The concrete dictated the tactics. This set the stage for a tragic collision. A highly confident but logistically starved American army, running on fumes and optimism, was advancing against a desperate, scraped-together German defense that relied entirely on thousands of tons of immovable concrete to equalize the battlefield. Acting on intelligence that dismissed the Westwall as a dilapidated ruin, Allied commanders ordered their vanguard units to execute a swift, uninterrupted push straight through the hills. It was meant to be a brisk, triumphant march into the enemy's homeland. But the reality waiting in the damp dark of those bunkers was about to violently shatter that illusion. In mid-September, lead elements of the American First Army pushed out of the border forests and into the rolling pastures south of Aachen. They advanced using the same aggressive doctrine that had carried them across France. Infantry squads moving swiftly in the open, supported by the momentum of Sherman tanks. But the moment the armored columns reached the first staggered rows of dragon's teeth, the advance violently snapped shut. The Shermans could not crush the concrete pyramids. Their tracks ground helplessly against the immovable barriers, forcing the drivers to halt in the open or search for narrow, muddy bypasses. That was exactly the trigger the defenders were waiting for. As the tank stalled, the seemingly empty hillsides suddenly tore open. Heavy machine gun fire did not just come from the front, it came from multiple, overlapping angles. The west wall's brutal geometry was designed with interlocking fields of fire. The moment an American rifle squad dove into a ditch or a crater to escape one stream of tracers, they blindly exposed their flanks to another hidden pillbox. The American infantry found themselves pinned down in the freezing mud, taking heavy casualties from an enemy they could not even locate. The years of neglect that Allied intelligence had mocked now worked entirely against the attackers. Thick brambles, overgrown tree roots, and layers of natural earth masked the narrow firing slits so perfectly that the concrete structures were practically invisible until they opened fire from mere yards away. Standard American tactical doctrine, suppressive fire and flanking maneuvers, failed completely. To flank a position, you first have to find it. To suppress it, your weapons need to penetrate it. The standard light mortars and infantry anti-tank weapons bounced harmlessly off the bunkers. Even the heavily rationed artillery strikes called in from the rear did little more than churn the soil and strip away the vegetation. High explosive shrapnel was useless against 7 feet of reinforced steel and concrete. When the stalled Shermans attempted to pivot and lay down suppressing fire, pre-sighted German anti-tank guns, perfectly coordinated with the bunker garrisons, began picking them off. The concrete dragon's teeth had done exactly what they were engineered to do: corral the American armor into carefully measured, inescapable kill zones. Back at battalion command posts, the radio reports streaming in from the frontier shattered any remaining optimism. The illusion of a hollow, abandoned shell evaporated in a matter of hours. Bypassing the network was mathematically impossible. The fortifications stretched for hundreds of miles, deeply anchored into the dense, muddy terrain to the south and the urban sprawl of Aachen to the north. Trying to rush the line with sheer numbers would only feed men into a mechanical slaughter. The chilling realization set in at every level of command. There would be no swift breakout, no open flank, and no reliance on speed. Stripped of their defining mobility, the American infantrymen pinned in the dirt realized that to survive the next few yards, they would have to invent a new, incredibly violent way to fight. The realization that standard battlefield doctrine had completely failed forced a rapid, brutal evolution on the ground. Pinned in the muddy pastures south of Aachen, American commanders understood that a rifle company organized for mobile warfare was functionally useless against thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. You could not maneuver around the fortifications, and you could not simply overwhelm them with a mass infantry charge. A conventional assault would only result in a catastrophic loss of life. To survive the Westwall, the American army had to completely deconstruct its tactics and rebuild them for a microscopic, agonizingly slow war of demolition. The solution was the creation of specialized bunker-busting assault teams. Platoon leaders began stripping their squads of standard equipment, pulling men out of their traditional roles, and combining regular infantrymen with specialized combat engineers. They formed heavily armed, tightly coordinated micro-units designed specifically to dismantle the German defenses one isolated pillbox at a time. The psychological shift was profound. The men were no longer fighting a war of sweeping flanking maneuvers across miles of open French countryside. They were fighting for inches of muddy German soil. The assault teams divided themselves into 3 strict elements: a base of fire, a breaching element, and a demolition crew. Their loadouts changed drastically. Standard rifles were supplemented with an excessive number of Browning automatic rifles and light machine guns to maximize suppressive firepower. The engineers and demolition men abandoned their heavy packs, loading themselves down with satchel charges, canvas bags stuffed with raw TNT, heavy wire cutters, and white phosphorus grenades. They were transforming themselves from a mobile vanguard into a slow, deliberate wrecking crew. But having the right equipment was only the beginning of the problem. Executing the assault required a level of perfectly synchronized violence that left absolutely no margin for human error. The immediate barrier to even reaching the concrete was a dense, layered perimeter of barbed wire, concertina coils, and buried anti-personnel mines. This outer perimeter was not placed randomly. It was mathematically surveyed to hold attacking infantry in the exact center of the German machine gun kill zones. To breach this, the American assault teams relied on a specialized weapon born in the trenches of the First World War, the Bangalore torpedo. These were simple, highly effective devices consisting of 5-foot-long steel tubes packed tightly with high explosives. But employing them against the West Wall was an agonizingly slow and terrifying process. Combat engineers had to low crawl through the freezing mud, dragging the heavy metal pipes behind them, while grazing machine gun fire sliced through the grass mere inches above their helmets. They could not simply throw the explosive from a safe distance. They had to physically reach the obstacle, push the first steel tube deep into the tangle of wire, remain exposed in the mud, thread a second tube onto the back of the first, and push it further. Sometimes it required 3 or 4 interlocking sections to span the entire depth of the wire entanglement. The entire time they were assembling the explosive, these engineers were perfectly silhouetted against the earth for any German defender looking through a magnified optical sight. The vulnerability was absolute. A single sniper round or a stray burst of machine gun fire striking the steel tube could detonate the entire payload right in their hands. The men executing this task operated in a state of sustained, suffocating tension, knowing that their survival depended entirely on the suppressive fire of their squad mates, keeping the German gunners pinned away from their narrow firing slits. When the fuse was finally pulled and the Bangalore detonated, the massive shockwave violently vaporized a narrow path through the wire and safely triggered the hidden tripwires of the adjacent mines. But this tactical success instantly created a new, highly lethal problem. The explosion cleared a path, but it also signaled the exact location of the breach to every German gunner in the sector. The narrow, 3-foot-wide gap through the smoking wire immediately became a perfectly sighted funnel of death. To exploit the breach, the American infantry had to sprint through that narrow gap, fully exposing themselves to the pillbox. Standard weapons remained entirely useless. Mortar shells shattered harmlessly against the concrete roofs, and heavy artillery, heavily rationed due to the ongoing supply crisis, could only churn the surrounding earth without penetrating the 7-foot-thick walls. The only way to survive the sprint was to rely entirely on the architectural flaws of the bunker itself. The assault teams had to meticulously study the geometry of the pillbox while under fire, searching for the dead zones, the blind spots where the fixed German machine guns could not depress or traverse far enough to reach them. Once a squad identified a blind spot, they crawled through the mud, yard by yard, utilizing the natural dips in the terrain, bomb craters, or the shattered remains of trees for defilade. When they finally managed to maneuver within striking distance, the final phase of the assault was initiated. Suppressive fire was poured directly at the bunker's embrasures, the narrow, stepped concrete slits designed to deflect incoming rounds while allowing the defenders to fire out. The goal was not to penetrate the concrete, but to force the German gunners to step back from their weapons. Under this covering fire, American soldiers hurled white phosphorus grenades directly against the face of the pillbox. The phosphorus erupted in a blinding flash, throwing thick, impenetrable clouds of toxic white smoke directly into the firing slits. This was not just a visual screen. It was a physical attack on the bunker's decaying infrastructure. Because the older fortifications lacked modern mechanical ventilation, the thick, choking smoke was rapidly sucked into the cramped interior, instantly blinding the optics and suffocating the defenders. With the embrasure blinded, the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal was brought forward, the M2 flamethrower. The operators of these weapons carried over 70 pounds of highly volatile, pressurized, jellied gasoline on their backs. The heavy tanks severely restricted their movement, making them slow, cumbersome, and incredibly prominent targets. The psychological weight of carrying a massive, unarmored fuel bomb into a machine gun duel was immense. The operator had to step out of the blind spot, fully expose himself to the firing slit, and unleash a precisely aimed stream of liquid fire directly into the concrete opening. The tactical objective of the flamethrower was rarely to burn the defenders directly. Instead, the weapon was designed to exploit the enclosed geometry of the pillbox. The intense, roaring combustion of the jellied gasoline instantly consumed all the available oxygen within the concrete chamber, creating a vacuum that suffocated anyone inside, while driving the remaining defenders away from their weapons in sheer panic. Only then could the demolition men rush forward, thrusting heavy satchel charges of raw TNT directly into the embrasures or down the steel ventilation shafts to permanently silence the position. It was a grueling, terrifying methodology, and when it worked, it was a testament to American tactical adaptation. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated, and the German defenders were not passive victims waiting to be burned out. From the perspective of the German troops inside the concrete, the American assaults were terrifying. The raw concussion of high explosives hammering the exterior walls, the blinding white smoke, and the roar of the flamethrowers created a claustrophobic nightmare. The ad hoc garrisons of recovering wounded, older reservists, and drafted civilians often panicked in the dark, suffocating confines of the pillboxes. Yet, despite the fear and the lack of elite training, the defensive network functioned exactly as it had been engineered to function. The German High Command quickly realized that the raw mass of the concrete acted as a massive force multiplier. They did not need highly trained stormtroopers to hold the line. The architecture itself did the fighting. The true lethality of the West Wall was not found in any single bunker, but in the mathematical relationship between them. The entire defensive belt was laid out in a staggered, deeply overlapping grid. Whenever an American assault team painstakingly navigated the minefields, blew the wire, and successfully crawled into the blind spot of one pillbox, they inevitably triggered a fatal trap. The blind spot of Bunker A was deliberately designed to be the primary, unobstructed kill zone for Bunker B, hidden 400 yards away in a perfectly camouflaged reverse slope. As the American flamethrower operator stood up to engage his target, believing he had outmaneuvered the defense, he was perfectly silhouetted against the concrete for a German machine gunner in a completely different, unseen fortification. The interlocking fields of fire meant that it was mathematically impossible to assault one position without being shot in the back by two others. The German defense became a cynical, calculated equation of trading space for extreme American casualties. They allowed the American assault teams to advance just deep enough into the network to become entangled in the crossfire, turning the pastures into geometric slaughterhouses. An American platoon would spend hours executing a flawless textbook assault, losing men to mines and sniper fire, only to be wiped out in seconds by an overlapping machine gun they never even knew was there. The sheer density of the camouflage, decades of overgrown roots, moss, and dense thickets made it virtually impossible to map the interlocking fields of fire before an attack. The Americans were forced to discover the hidden bunkers by letting them open fire, paying for the intelligence with the lives of their pointmen. Even when an assault team achieved the impossible, surviving the crossfire, burning out the embrasure, detonating the satchel charges, and finally silencing a pillbox, the nightmare was rarely over. The physical exhaustion of the GIs after clearing just one concrete box was profound. Covered in mud, shaking from adrenaline, and dragging their wounded back to the medical aid stations, the surviving infantrymen would establish a defensive perimeter around the captured bunker, and wait for the dawn. But the West Wall harbored a hidden, subterranean dimension that continually undermined the agonizing American gains. Beneath the rolling pastures and overgrown forests, the bunkers were frequently connected by a labyrinth of deep, reinforced communication trenches and buried telephone lines. These trenches were cut deeply into the earth, entirely shielded from American observation and immune to shrapnel. Under the cover of total darkness, German commanders utilized this hidden infrastructure to execute perfectly coordinated infiltrations. Instead of launching a costly, open-ground counterattack, German reserves simply crawled through the subterranean network, navigating the dark tunnels that led directly back into the rear access doors of the captured pillboxes. Dawn would break over the Aachen sector, and the exhausted American troops would slowly realize that the exact same pillbox they had lost 20 men taking the previous afternoon was suddenly alive again. The heavy mechanical ripping sound of an MG-42 would erupt from a concrete slit that was supposed to be dead, firing directly into the rear of the American positions. The psychological blow of this tactic was devastating. The GIs were forced to realize that bleeding for a piece of ground did not guarantee holding it. They were trapped in a relentless, cyclical nightmare, frequently ordered to assault, clear, and detonate the exact same fortification twice, and sometimes 3 times in a single week. This relentless, claustrophobic grind was chewing up American rifle companies at a catastrophic rate. Battalions that had crossed the border with 800 combat-effective men were being rapidly reduced to 400, then 200, bleeding out for a few acres of shattered trees and a dozen concrete boxes. The piecemeal destruction of the fortifications was fundamentally unsustainable. The logistically starved American offensive was losing its momentum entirely, sinking into a static war of attrition that heavily favored the entrenched defenders. The realization swept through the command posts that feeding individual assault teams into the interlocking crossfire would eventually stall the entire advance. To crack the sector and break the defensive grid, they could no longer afford to fight bunker by bunker. They had to identify the structural heart of the network, the heavily defended linchpin anchoring the entire grid, and concentrate a desperate, all-or-nothing effort to shatter it before the American advance collapsed entirely in the mud. The grim, cyclical reality of taking and losing the same concrete positions violently dispelled the prevailing optimism at Supreme Headquarters. For decades after the war, popular historical narratives would often claim that overwhelming American technological superiority and massed artillery simply smashed through the West Wall with calculated efficiency. But the after-action reports and casualty ledgers from the First Army paint a far more brutal, uncomfortable reality. The initial penetration of the border defenses was not a triumph of machines. It was an agonizing, high-casualty infantry nightmare. The hidden cost of this slow, grinding advance was the systematic destruction of American rifle companies. Entire platoons were being wiped out not by elite SS Panzer divisions or superior German technology, but by the cold, mathematical efficiency of poured concrete, barbed wire, and overlapping machine gun grids. In the sector surrounding Aachen, veteran American infantry regiments that had fought their way across France were suffering casualty rates approaching 50% in a matter of weeks. The loss of experienced company commanders, platoon sergeants, and combat engineers was irreplaceable. Replacement troops, rushed straight from replacement depots without specialized bunker assault training, were being thrown into the line, only to be cut down in the pre-surveyed kill zones before they even learned how to navigate a Bangalore torpedo through a minefield. This brutal attrition exposed the fundamental flaw in the American strategy of maintaining a continuous, broad front offensive while suffering a severe logistical crisis. The First Army was slowly bleeding to death in the mud of the borderlands, trading hundreds of lives for isolated pillboxes that possessed no strategic value on their own. This unsustainable bleeding could not continue. The strategy of chipping away at the edges of the interlocking grid was failing. To break the deadlock and save the infantry from systematic annihilation, American commanders realized they had to abandon piecemeal assaults, concentrate their dwindling resources, and direct a raw, concentrated hammer blow against the single most fortified, heavily defended geographical linchpin anchoring the entire sector. The chosen target was a massive, heavily reinforced bunker complex dominating the primary ridgeline directly covering the approaches to Aachen. This was the undisputed linchpin of the local defense, a sprawling fortress of poured concrete that commanded the only viable road capable of supporting heavy American armor. If this central node fell, the interlocking geometry of the surrounding pillboxes would blind itself. The assault was launched in the early hours, cloaked under a dense artillery barrage of white phosphorus that mixed with the thick autumn fog. The battlefield instantly dissolved into a claustrophobic, zero-visibility nightmare. American riflemen stumbled through the dense gray haze, guided only by the mechanical ripping sound of German machine guns and the snap of blind tracers cutting through the smoke. As the leading infantry platoons were inevitably pinned down in the freezing mud, the momentum of the entire American advance bottlenecked right in front of the linchpin bunker. Suppressive fire bounced harmlessly off its thickest walls. The deadlock had to be broken by hand. The grim task fell to a small squad of combat engineers. Stripped of their standard packs and rifles, they carried only heavy canvas satchels packed with dozens of pounds of raw TNT and composition explosives. To crack a structure of this magnitude, they could not simply throw grenades at a firing slit. They had to physically reach the heavy steel access doors of the fortification and stack enough raw explosives to structurally shatter the concrete foundation. Hauling that massive, awkward weight meant the engineers could not move quickly, nor could they stay entirely in defilade. They scrambled through the muddy craters, utterly exposed to the overlapping fields of fire. To buy them the precious seconds they needed to survive, American flamethrower operators stepped out of cover and directly into the pre-surveyed kill zones. Roaring streams of pressurized, jellied gasoline slammed against the face of the pillbox. The weapon was not used to burn the garrison, but to blind them. The intense combustion sucked the oxygen from the immediate atmosphere, filling the optical slits with thick, impenetrable black smoke and driving the panicked defenders away from their weapons in the darkness. Under that terrifying, momentary screen of fire, the combat engineers made their final, desperate sprint. Plunging into the blind spot of the bunker, they frantically stacked their heavy satchel charges directly against the primary steel doors, pulled the friction fuses, and threw themselves blindly into the nearest waterlogged craters. The sheer force of the concentrated detonation violently shook the ridgeline. A massive shockwave tore the heavy steel doors from their hinges and fractured the 7-foot-thick concrete walls. The suffocating roar of the explosion instantly silenced the central position. The mathematical geometry of the German defense was finally broken. As the thick dust and smoke began to settle, a narrow, shattered corridor lay open in the concrete, and the idling engines of the waiting American Sherman tanks roared to life to pour through the breach. As the American armor finally rolled past the shattered concrete and deeper into Germany, the smoke settled over the rolling cow pastures south of Aachen. It was late autumn now. The landscape that had looked so harmless to the lead scouts in early September was unrecognizable, permanently scarred by thousands of artillery craters and the blackened remains of destroyed bunkers. The American army had indeed cracked the west wall. The fortifications were not an impenetrable fortress, and they did not permanently stop the Allied war machine. The obsolete bunkers had ultimately fallen to tactical adaptation and raw demolition. But as military planners evaluated the grueling weeks of combat, a deeply unsettling realization emerged. In the cold calculus of grand strategy, the tactical defeat of the Siegfried Line masked a massive victory for the defenders. The damp, decaying concrete was never meant to win the war, and Field Marshal Walter Model never expected his scraped-together garrisons to permanently hold back the mechanized might of the United States. The network was designed to execute one specific mathematical function: to force the enemy to trade time for blood. By trapping the First Army in a primitive, claustrophobic siege, the Westphal successfully achieved its true purpose. It completely absorbed the terrifying momentum of the Allied breakout from Normandy. Instead of a rapid, triumphant march into the German industrial heartland, the Americans spent crucial months systematically dismantling outdated pillboxes yard by muddy yard. That agonizing delay changed the timeline of the European theater. The weeks lost to the interlocking machine gun fire bought the German High Command their absolute most precious and scarce resource. While American infantrymen were locked in a microscopic war of attrition around Aachen, the Third Reich utilized that exact window of time to secretly scrape together, refit, and position its final armored reserves. The blood spent on obsolete concrete directly provided Germany the breathing room it needed to prepare its massive, catastrophic winter surprise in the Ardennes. The greatest weapon of the Siegfried Line wasn't the artillery or the second-rate troops manning the defenses. It was the raw concrete itself. It proved that in modern warfare, even an obsolete, forgotten wall can exact a terrifying toll if an army is forced to climb it.